Okay, shoot.
All right.
I think so far as I can go back, having written my memoirs up to a point, uh, it was probably theater, including movies, by the way, because I saw them at the same time at the age of whatever, 6, 7, 8, 9. And in a way, including radio, which was the big thing in a normal family then before television. But that was not so much a fascination as a theater where living people are faced with living people, as a rule, okay? And I still vividly remember stuff I saw in elementary school, that's to say I was whatever, 8 or 9. Christmas shows for kids with the devil in a red suit, Krampus, okay, on the stage and such stuff. And theater is, to my mind, a kind of the stage together with the audience is a kind of an enclosed space-time, an Einsteinian cosmic island, so to speak, in miniature, where laws can be different than in everyday. For example, you can have a devil in a red cloth, you know. Or you can have all kinds of wondrous things happening and happy endings which were not true in real life, or whatever. And looking back at it, I wrote once an article about a theater director friend of mine who was handled very roughly by the theater establishment in Zagreb and became actually famous in Italy more. Theater is a kind of utopian, a possibility of utopian joy, I would say, when done well, when done by good actors and under a good director with a purpose which everybody likes, and it finds then its own audience, hopefully. So it is not far from theater to science fiction, or, you know, science fiction, as the Russian formalists would say, foregrounds the device. It's really a cosmic island somewhere out there in space-time, you know, which is implicit in theater. So it's kind of neat when you show what you are doing, as Brecht liked to repeat. Do something and then show that you are doing it. So I think that was my first fascination, and it connects, as you see, very easily with some of the later fascinations.
So from there, did you move straight to Brecht later in years, or you came to Brecht kind of through some other channels?
I came to Brecht through being deeply involved for years and years on end. I forget how many, but certainly 10 or 12 from my, let us say, 23rd, 4th year to the mid-30s. I was deeply involved with student theater. The Zagreb one, which was quite famous, SEC, Student Experimental Theater, and it was a part of a Europe-wide association, which was called the International Union of Student Theaters, and we met 4 times a year. In May in Zagreb, Majski Festival, May Festival, Easter in Parma, in Italy, June in Erlangen, in West Germany. It was Western Europe plus Yugoslavia, who was kicked out by the East, of course. And in October, we used to go to Istanbul, but Turkish Secret Service and police didn't like that much. A lot of young people doing God knows what in God knows how many languages that we cannot control. So they closed it down and it moved to Nancy in France. And Nancy was run by a famous young man called Jacques Lang, who became then the socialist minister of culture. He began in student theater, just like, for example, Patrice Chéreau began in student theater, who then became a famous movie and opera director, and I could give you a few more examples. I mean, Giorgio Strehler began in a Trieste student theater, the great Piccolo Teatro della Scala director, probably the greatest Italian post-war theater director, and he had a lot of competition, so to say that means something. And student theater, the German student theater was playing Brecht. Aha! He was playing the early Brecht, the anarchist Brecht, the Drums in the Night and whatever. I remember the horrible shock the Zagreb petit bourgeois audience had when somebody, the director, who was a friend of mine from München, had somebody piss at the corner during the performance, which is not, I mean, mime pissing, you know, piss on the stage, my God, you know, anti-Stanislavski, you know. And I had, I don't know what, as you know, the dinar, Yugoslav dinar wasn't convertible. So when we went to Germany, we got diaries, we got daily allowances, which was something like 8 marks or whatever, ridiculous, you know. However, since we were there in the student dormitories and we ate in the student canteen, it was all organized kind of on a, how should I say, collectivist, medieval student basis, you know. We saved some of this money and I bought some books by Brecht, you know. His essays on theater, some of his things, wow. I wrote an essay saying Bert Brecht, the first dramatist of the 21st century, assuming the socialism will win, of course. The 21st century will be socialist and he will be the great ancestor. I stole this actually from somebody else who had the same optimistic presupposition, so we were wrong. But anyway, he's the first great dramatist of almost socialism or communism or whatever you may call it. And Brecht is, for me, Brecht is taught, I'm told, in West Germany as, under the rubric, the dramatist of reason, which makes instantly all kids hate him. That's, of course, wrong. Brecht is full of passion. It's kind of icy surface over a volcano, you know. But he does infuse passion with reason, that is to say, it must stand the test of reason. That was real rare. Of course, Shakespeare had, I mean, but in the modern drama, and I was studying drama and later taught drama as performance and as text. So that was absolutely a rare bird. Wow, that's also possible. Then he invented a lot of techniques how to do it, which were interesting themselves. The techniques were techniques taken from comedy theater, from vaudeville, from clowns, and transferred into the sphere of high seriousness, right? Well, that is really something new in the history. I mean, there are very few, what Bloch called novums, new things in history. But when they do happen, it's what Badiou calls an event. That was an event. Okay, Brecht. And Brecht hit my whole generation like thunder, like lightning. I mean, lightning with thunder, I guess, lightning for illumination. So then I began reading him, and finally I went to see Brecht's theater in East Berlin. Always traveling to see, for example, the Stockholm Student Theater. They had a festival in Stockholm, so you stop in East Berlin 3 or 4 days, and your student friends put you up since you have no money. And you go and see the theater and you say, I'm a theater critic, could you give me a free ticket? And so on. It was all done on a non-cash basis in those days, 50s, 60s. And you could do it. You could travel by autostop, You could travel on the highway. I traveled from Paris to Naples. When I was studying in England, I came back in the 50s. So that is Brecht, and then there is a whole slew of Brechtians and Brechtoids, so to speak, people like Mayakovsky or Nazim Hikmet or whatever, people who were writing in which he, at some point of his life, which he later forsook, called the epic theater. It's not actually epic, but anyway, that's a German debate. We had a little group of people in Zagreb, writers, intellectuals who my age, which means in the 20s, which means in the early 50s, that passed science fiction books from hand to hand. Of course, you couldn't buy foreign books, not because of censorship, because nobody had the money to pay in pounds or liras or whatever. So there were all these, there was the famous Grof Conklin anthology published in 47, a huge book of 20, 30 stories by all the 40s people, Heinlein, Asimov, Van Vogt, whatever. This went hand to hand and we all read it. And some people started even writing science fiction from this group, And I came to science fiction actually from reading Wells and Verne. That is to say, Verne was in the whole of Europe the most popular writer for kids. You read it when you were 11, 12, 13, right? At least the boys did. I don't know what the girls did. Wells I read after the war, 15, 16, 17. We had a very well-furnished British Council library in Zagreb. So when American science fiction hit us, we were well prepared. We had the background, and we said, wow, this is interesting. This is like, let's say, the general staff of the army trying campaigns in peacetime, what could be done here, what could be done there. And if you fail, there isn't much wrong because it's only on paper. Nobody's going to die. So that I remember somebody calling science fiction the general staff of humanity in a fit of enthusiasm, like, trying out the futures. I think a German. And then the first thing began to be written about science fiction in Germany, in France, and the famous book by Kingsley Amis, New Maps of Hell, his lectures in the USA. My writing in general, I found the key to my writing much later when I was studying Walter Benjamin. Walter Benjamin said, I write books I would like to read but cannot find anywhere. So I couldn't find anything on science fiction, and especially it was taboo for high literature as taught in the university, I mean, we're talking about Balzac and Thomas Mann, and, maybe the Scandinavians, Ibsen, Strindberg, that's okay. That was very forward-looking. That was the great wave of the 1890s to 1914, let's say. The backward-looking people were doing the post-romantics, 1820, 1830, So we said, well, and what about this? I mean, so I started writing about this, and there was absolutely nobody else in my Federal Republic of Croatia. There may have been one or two people in Slovenia or Serbia, very few, I think, very, very few. And wrote, my first book was called Odluki Anadolunika, which is an anagram I'm quite fond of, which means from Lucian of Samosate, the old Greek writer about flights to planets, whatever, to the Lunik. Lunik is the Russian thing that landed on the moon, the Russian robot, whatever, machine. Now that was a huge book, about 500 pages of anthology, beginning with the predecessors. I forget what was, certainly Lucian was in there. Maybe there was a bit of Plato, but I never liked Plato too much. I mean, I admire Plato, which is different from liking him. Like I can admire Ezra Pound. He's a fascist, goddammit, but he writes poetry well. But I certainly couldn't like him too much. Yeah. So that's how I fell into it, you know, unwittingly. There was no plan. My plan was to write the history and theory of Croatian drama and theater, which I never did. I mean, I did kind of halfway, but you know, I got kicked out and left and said, okay, you don't want it, I'm going to do other stuff. You meaning, you know, the society at large, which allowed my being kicked out, so to speak. Okay. So I got very offended and left and did other things. Whereas in the USA, that was also quite new, and I think I was the second or third or fourth person in North America to have a science fiction class, and probably the first one to have a graduate class. Before me were people like Bruce Franklin and so on. That's to say, I was actually hired in the year of student revolt to teach drama and science fiction because the students wanted power in the university and science fiction. No, you're not going to get power, but you're going to get science fiction. You know? So they got it in the shape of me. And they were very shocked when I appeared in a suit the first day. You know, American hippies? Okay, Montreal is just above New York if you take the train. There's a train from New York through Albany to Montreal, and it's much cheaper than University in New York, so half of New York went to McGill. And here is a sizzlingly hot red Marxist coming in a suit. Wow! You know, great disappointment. I became a friend with some of them. Later they said, oh, we were so disappointed when, you know. Well, I learned today from Lisa Garforth that we need not only cognitive estrangement, but also passion. It wasn't meant like that. Cognitive for me includes passion. Cognitive means anything that helps us to understand, which is certainly Socratic reason, but which is certainly not only Socratic reason, but the involvement of all your lymphic system or whatever it is, your body, right? Like Lyman Sargent talks about body utopias. He's quite right, of course. It was very simple. The genre was called science fiction. Okay. Science I didn't like for two reasons. Number one, I studied science. I have 6 years an MSc equivalent in science, okay? And I love science and I love the scientific method, but not when you are doing literature. Literature cannot be science by definition. What do we substitute? What is a higher category that can include science but is not limited by it? Well, the best I found is cognition. Okay? Estrangement I stole from Brecht. Very simple. Okay? Brecht uses it inside a realistic or quasi-realistic. He imagines a 15th century China, which is really 1910 Germany of his youth, you know, with whores and whatever. But it's supposed to be realistic, in the style of his youth. Okay, he was born in 1898, so the style of 1908, 1914, what was seen in the theater, which was more or less realistic, Hauptmann, Ledekind, and so on. And into that he plants the subversive notion of estrangement. Now, if you make of estrangement the framework of your story, so that the very space-time in which the story happens is strange and has to be explained, you know. There's the famous science fiction first line, we landed in the light of the blue sun. What does it mean? It's blue but not yellow, which means we're not in this solar system. So by a number of such hints right at the beginning of the story, and then you say, unfortunately we had diving masks because the atmosphere was of methane. So you know you're on that planet and not on an oxygen, and so on. And, well, this lends itself very well to scientific stuff, purely scientific, like the chemistry of methane, but also to socio-political stuff, okay? We landed in a place where women reign. We landed in a place where the intelligent inhabitants change in the middle of life as larvae change to butterflies, etc. So I somehow got the inspiration, the muse must have been present, to put these two together. Instead of saying science fiction, I said cognitive estrangement. It was purely a substitution, a game of finding the proper categories of a higher power, okay, but which could comprise science fiction and help to explain it, one hopes. And this somehow took off and got famous. I don't know why. I've written 15 such things, 2 or 3 got famous. The Novum, you know, others which I like just as much, but don't find in Wikipedia, you know, or whatever. This is the fate of reception. You know, writers certain things pass because they hit some kind of resonance. Why? I didn't know that would hit a resonance. I had no idea. I was purely intent on being as precise and scientific, let's say scholarly, as possible. But as I say, the muse comes in wondrous ways you never know. In secret, etc. As a thief in the night. Epistemology is that branch of philosophy which attempts to enlighten us. Why do we think the way we think? Or how do we understand what we think we understand? Epistemology I didn't care about at all until Yugoslavia and the Soviet Union collapsed. Then I said, wow, what did we think wrongly? Never mind the Soviet Union. I knew everything about the Soviet Union when I was 18. You know that Yugoslavia broke with the Soviet Union in 1948, so I had no illusions about that at all. But I did have illusions about Yugoslavia, partly rightly, because the first 20 years of Yugoslavia were glorious. I think I wrote a book where I explain this, On the Traces of Benjamin, because I couldn't find such a book. So, how come we thought what we thought, which turned out wrong, and what are, if we go back to, as Brecht would like to say, to events behind the events, what is behind that event of having had wrong presuppositions, okay, wrong trusts, wrong passions, whatever. Well, that is a matter for epistemology. It is also a polemic. I have a young friend who did a PhD in Turin on Hegel, with whom I debate this. It is a polemic against ontology. Ontology talks about what really exists, and its great master in the 20th century is, let's say, Heidegger. I much dislike Heidegger. His reading of poetry is awful. His reading of... and on top of all, he was also quite logically a Nazi supporter, because it fit well into his system. Not being too stupid, he saw that politics is not going very well according even to his right-wing system. So he was a real ardent supporter for a year or so. Only, but nonetheless, there is a sentence in Brecht's Life of Galileo, you know, when Galileo is asked, I don't know, by the inquisitors, what do you really think about the heavens, you know? I mean, you look at it with your telescope, you don't find God. Or his pupils ask him, I forget. And he says, we are like worms writhing in a clod of earth. Our eyesight is feeble. I don't really believe we are ready, humanity, until we have purged ourselves from, let us say, the class system, and then had 200 years of peace, and detoxifying the earth, and so on. Then we can begin talking about the universe and about ontology. What is the real reality is the universe, of course, around us, which determines all that happens to the earth, and the earth determines all that happens to us. So, on the one hand, it was politically necessary for me to study epistemology a little bit, and it was also a reaction to this epistemological bent. We are going to talk about what is the real reality, never mind the stupid politics and all of that, never mind the stupid economy, and never mind our stupid rulers, what is the real reality? But how can you say never mind to forces that shape your life? Okay, that seems to me ruled out of court, right out to the beginning. That must be wrong. So, political epistemology is a way of trying to talk intelligently about politics, such as the Russian Revolution, the Yugoslav event, and so on. And, by the way, today, okay, where we are heading as the nice, I think it's an American proverb, to hell in a handbasket, or is it English? Well, it must be American. It sounds American. Utopia, famously, a word invented by Thomas More, means two things. Utopia, Greek written O-U, and eutopia, which in English sound the same, meaning good. That is to say, a non-place which is a good place. A good place which is not the place that we know, which means the place that we know is not good. Okay? That is to say, Britain, Europe, whatever. The courts. More knew a lot about the courts, and he lost his head because of that. And he hit on this idea of democratizing Plato. Plato's guardians are an elite, okay? They are communists because, as many examples can show of elites that share everything within it in order to oppress, first of all, Sparta, which was Plato's neighbor. in Utopia, everybody shares everything. Okay, although being a realist, he said there are some slaves and so on, so on. Okay, because they had wars. So it's a society that replicates England feature by feature, except it's much better. It has 54 towns, just like England has 54 counties. But England is triangular, whereas Utopia is round. It's more perfect if you look at the map of Utopia. So it has an inlet, but etc. It was, in other words, a project of systematic, better life based on communism. Wow. No wonder he's lost his head. And there was a whole slew of followers. At some point, mainly after the Industrial Revolution and the rise of mass wars financed by capitalism, and capitalism rising on the basis of wars and so on, that's to say after Napoleon roughly, and the US Civil War and so on, at some point people said, hey, what about if we had a worse future and not a better future? Well, that can be used in two ways. The way it was used mainly is to say, yes, let's have a worse future as an awful warning. I'm going to show you this. Now don't follow this. Do the opposite, which will not bring, nobody tells you what is the opposite. You should find it for yourself. Although people like, say, Marge Piercy will later begin to tell you, you have to kill the doctor in the madhouse, right? Who imprisons this female protagonist, right? That's to say you have to rebel, right? In a way, the basic value system of utopia and dystopia is absolutely identical. It is a critique of, a radical critique of the existing situation on the basis of either showing you what is better or implying by contraries, which is also a Brechtian way. Brecht shows you an awful situation, and you, in the audience, ought to conclude that the premises of the system underlying the situation ought to be changed. Okay? And he has all kinds of tricks in order to make you think about it, including the famous estrangement. Lately, this is 95 or 99% of all the writings in Utopia. Is either utopia or dystopia, a radically better situation, world, possible world, or radically worse one. Both of them ought to tell you, dear reader, that this one we live in is no good and ought to be radically changed. However, we have now a situation that I call anti-utopia, which was used for all kinds of things, but if one defines it the way that I define it, is a system excogitated on purpose to cut down the roots of every possible utopianism, both utopian and dystopian. That system existed in literature as of, I don't know, the people who hated the French Revolution, Edmund Burke, some English romantics and so on, and was formulated as a literary subgenre in the 1880s, 90s, and then after the Russian Revolution by all kinds of emigres and haters of the Bolsheviks. It was literarily almost zero. It was written on a low level. It was no good. I mean, the best writer, if one can call, if I'm allowed the word, of that whole stream is Ayn Rand. Okay, so you can imagine what the others are like if she is the best. It was uninteresting. It was an oddity. But what hit me is looking at the situation of the last 20 years, let's say. What if this anti-utopia came to power? It became our existential ecosystem, so to speak. I don't mean literally ecosystem, but the system that determines us. The system of thinking, the system of power, the system of financing, the system of education, the system of mass media, which is all, okay, gleichgeschaltet, as Goebbels would say, it's all on the same wavelength, right? Well, then we are in a totally new situation. That is to say, if you are a reader, you have a contract of freedom with the book you're reading. You can read it or not. You can like it or not. You are outside it. If you are inside the system, you don't have any freedom. You can, of course, like it or dislike it, but the system has many, many ways to entice you to like it, although it makes you live so badly that it has also many ways to repress you if those enticements don't work. And that is what I'm speaking about tomorrow, our existential anti-utopia. In other words, I started as a total formalist talking about literary genres. But the powers that be, as Kipling would say, that we live under, do not allow us to say this is literature and culture and this is politics, not wish that it were possible. I don't especially love politics and economics. But if they rule you, if they are what the Greeks call destiny, and you want to change your destiny, then you must say, I cannot, as a professional student of literature, isolate this from what determines it. And that is why I talk about anti-utopia. Our existential anti-utopia, never mind, it gets its force not from literature, it gets its force for the millionfold repetition in every medium of the world. Okay? So it doesn't need to be good literature. I mean, if you are told it on the news every day. Of course. Oh, no doubt. If we could have changed the oligarchy, if we would have developed the Workers' Council to be really the basis of our power system up to the federal government.
And if the outside powers didn't meddle in?
And if the outside powers didn't meddle, which up to about 1973, the oil shock, they didn't. We dug our own grave first, then they pushed us into it. Very gladly, of course. This upstart nobody who goes around talking of the third world, whatever, doesn't want to be either under me or under you. That means Russia and America, right? Who is the bottom? It should be destroyed. And it was destroyed, you know, by German banks and the Vatican, more or less.
Was it better than what it's now?
In the first 20 years, yes, in spades. In the last 20 years, I was away, so I cannot say that. I think that even a bad, degenerate, quasi-non-socialism was in some ways better. Let me give you an example. I had a brilliant young friend in Novi Sad who made a PhD and called Ivan Radenkovic, who was a specialist about labor relationships in Serbia, which are awful, as you can imagine. He died of a heart attack at the age of 31. Why? He had no health insurance. He never went to a doctor. He couldn't pay a doctor. Now, this would not have happened even in degenerate Yugoslavia of 1980s, which had a horrible inflation and all kinds of bad things happening. even the peasants who were private possessors of land and should have been hated by Marxists had health service. They had to pay for it a little bit, but they had it. Everybody had a doctor. So what am I to say? And nobody killed anybody. My wife is a Serbian from Bosnia, so what should I shoot her? I'm supposed to be a Croatian, a Jewish Croatian or something, God knows what. What is that matter? There were a million mixed marriages in Yugoslavia, so a million people out of 16 or 18 million, right? 19? What are their children? They must be shot by one side or by the other. Well, I mean, that didn't happen in any degenerated form of Yugoslavia. What you could say is that the degeneration of Yugoslavia created the presupposition for the rise of nationalism and thus is indirectly a factor of corruption. Shakespeare put this very well. It was a commonplace of medieval theology. Lilies that fester smell far worse than weeds. Okay? So it was a lily which festered, and it smelled pretty bad. The weeds never smelled well. Okay? And I spent 6 years of my life going around libraries. I didn't go to archives because they weren't open yet in 1908, 9, 10. And anyway, I didn't have money to go and sit in Belgrade and ask somebody, the archive of the Central Committee. Now they're all open. I did use some people who had, like Olga Milosavljevic, you know, who had access and made PhDs. So my book is eminently changeable or amendable since I didn't go to the archives. But at any rate, I was the first to write an overview. I think I was, wasn't I? Of the good and bad sides of socialist Yugoslavia. And it had quite some good sides, and I remember that. The dawn, the bright dawn, is a famous poem by Wordsworth on the French Revolution. Bliss it was at the dawn, in that dawn, to be alive and to be young was very heaven. Okay? Then he liked the Girondist and turned against the revolution. But anyway, and he had that unhappy love affair in France and whatever, which is always emblematic of the politics, you know. So I really wish Yugoslavia had survived. I think the world would have been better, and the lives of a couple of million people who were kicked out of their homes would have been better. Much suffering, much blood, many lies, a huge amount of falsities, we would have been spared. Even if it had not been socialist, if it just remained a federative Yugoslavia. But of course one is bound with the other, in a way. I'm not sure. It would have had to be some kind of semi-social democrat in order to go on existing. That's to say, you would have had to have some kind of federal planning of some basic proportions of, I don't know, who prints the money and this kind of stuff. Yes, you were right to ask me.
All right, thank you.
I'm sorry this got to be so long.